Have you ever wondered why in Spain, practically every town has a church in its main square? Why so many Spanish names come from saints? Or why, even today, millions of people celebrate religious holidays, even if they don't set foot in a church the rest of the year? To understand that, we have to go way back, long before the Reconquista, before the Catholic monarchs, even before the Visigoths. We need to return to a time when Spain didn't even exist yet, only a Roman province called Hispania. By the middle of the 1st century AD, Hispania was part of the Roman world, a land of soldiers, merchants, farmers, and slaves. Latin was spoken, and gods like Jupiter, Venus, and Mars were worshipped. Religion was tightly woven into the power of the emperor. Life revolved around temples, sacrifices, and devotion to the official deities. But in the shadows, in the less watched corners of the empire, a strange new seed was beginning to grow. A new faith that spoke of humility, forgiveness, eternal life, and of a man who had been executed on a cross in Judea, Jesus of Nazareth. There's an old tradition that says the Apostle James even preached in Hispania, and that he was buried in Galatia. Others claim it was St. Paul who tried to reach these lands. Legends? Perhaps. There's no solid proof. But what we do know for certain is that by the 2nd century, small Christian communities already existed in cities like Mérida, Tarragona, and Córdoba. Imagine what that must have been like. People gathering secretly in private homes, reading letters from the apostles, praying together, sharing meals. They were slaves, soldiers, women, merchants, ordinary people who had found meaning in this new faith. But they also knew the risks. Being Christian in the Roman Empire could cost you your life. Rome didn't tolerate new cults that challenged the established order. Christians were accused of refusing to worship the gods, of rejecting sacrifices to the emperor, of plotting in the dark, and so they were persecuted. Some were executed in brutal ways, thrown to wild beasts in the arenas, or burned alive. In Hispania, one of the most famous cases is that of Saint Vincent, martyred in Valencia in the 4th century, and like him, many others. But those persecutions didn't stop Christianity from spreading. On the contrary, the more they were hunted, the more the faith grew. People used to say, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians." Everything changed in the year 313. Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, and Christianity was no longer illegal. From that moment on, churches came out of the shadows. Christians no longer prayed in secret. They built temples. Bishops were appointed, councils were held, and debates about doctrine shaped the faith. Bit by bit, Christianity became a powerful religion. And in the year 380, another emperor, Theodosius the Great, born in Hispania, by the way, declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was no longer just one faith among many. It was the faith of the state. In Hispania, churches began to rise. Dioceses were established. Monastic communities were founded. Christianity went from being persecuted to becoming part of the soul of the land. And even though Spain didn't yet exist, an identity was already forming, one that would, over time, become deeply Christian. But that story was far from over. Because while Christianity was flourishing, something was coming. From beyond the Rhine, from the lands of the so-called barbarians, new peoples were pushing the empire's borders. And soon, Hispania would no longer be Roman. It would become Visigothic. And with them, Christianity would take on a new face. When the Roman Empire began to crumble, Hispania was no exception. In the 5th century, the legions abandoned their posts, cities started to lose power, and little by little, peoples from northern Europe, whom the Romans called barbarians, began to settle across the Iberian Peninsula. Among them, the ones who eventually took control were the Visigoths. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who, after many wars and treaties, managed to establish their own kingdom in Hispania. But here's something curious. Although they ruled over a mostly Christian land, they didn't share the same faith. They weren't pagans like other barbarian tribes. They were Christians, but of a different branch, Arianism. Arianism was a doctrine that denied the full divinity of Jesus Christ. To the Arians, Christ was not equal to the Father. He was something inferior, a special being, yes, but not God. This difference, which might seem small to us today, was in fact a major controversy at the time. Catholics, those Christians who followed the official doctrine established by church councils, considered Arianism a heresy. For decades in Visigothic Hispania, there was a clear divide between the general population, mostly Catholic, and the Visigothic elites, who were Arian. It was a religious division, but also a social and political one. The Visigoths had their own laws, bishops, and rituals, and they didn't easily mix with the Hispano-Romans. But everything changed in the year 589. That year, the Visigothic king Record made a decision that changed the course of history. He converted to Catholicism. At the famous Third Council of Toledo, Record publicly renounced Arianism and brought the Visigothic nobility with him into the Catholic faith. It was a historic moment. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, all of Hispania, rulers and people, shared the same religion. This religious unity was key in solidifying the power of the Visigothic kingdom. The Catholic Church became a pillar of the state. Bishops held not only spiritual authority, but also political power. They were consulted in councils, helped draft laws, and had enormous influence over daily life. Visigothic Christianity wasn't just about faith. It was also about culture, law, and social organization. Laws were inspired by the commandments, monasteries multiplied, and education was in the hands of the church. Slowly, Hispania transformed into a deeply Christian land, not just by tradition, but through political and cultural conviction, and this wasn't a superficial Christianity. The Visigoths promoted the construction of churches, the copying of manuscripts, and the organization of church councils that dealt not only with religious matters, but also with civil ones. Some Spanish saints from this era, like Isidore of Seville, became major intellectual figures. Isidore, for instance, wrote encyclopedias that were read throughout Europe for centuries. Daily life revolved around religious festivals, the rhythms of the liturgical year, and the teachings of the bishops. The Christian calendar marked time, Lent, Easter, Christmas. Marriages were blessed in church, laws punished heresy, and the cross was a symbol seen everywhere. For nearly 2 centuries, Catholic Christianity was the foundation of Hispanic identity. There was no separation between religion and politics. To be Hispano was to be Christian. And although the Visigothic kingdom experienced conflicts, rebellions, and even civil wars, that religious foundation held firm. However, what the Visigoths didn't foresee was what was coming from the south. In the year 711, a new power, a new religion, and a new army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. And the Christian world of the Visigoths would change forever. The year 711 marked a turning point in the history of the Iberian Peninsula. Until then, Hispania was a Christian land, ruled by Visigothic kings and powerful bishops. But everything changed when a Muslim army, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa, defeated King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. In just a few years, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim control. Was it an invasion? A lightning conquest? A civil war exploited by outside forces? There are many theories. What's clear is that in a very short time, a new power took root in the peninsula, Al-Andalus, and with it came a new religion, Islam. It was something entirely different. New customs, a new language, new laws, and a new way of understanding faith. Muslims believed in one God, Allah, and in his prophet Muhammad. They didn't recognize Christ as the Son of God, although they did see him as a prophet. And their religion wasn't just spiritual. It was also political, legal, and social. The arrival of Islam didn't immediately spell the end of Christianity, but it did bring profound change. Christians who remained in Muslim-controlled areas were known as Mozarabs. They were allowed to keep practicing their faith, but with restrictions. They paid special taxes, couldn't build new churches or hold public processions, and their social status was lower than that of Muslims. Still, many Christians chose to stay. Some even adopted Arab customs. They spoke Arabic, dressed like Muslims, and their liturgy began incorporating Eastern influences. It was a curious mix. Christians who prayed in Latin, but lived in the Andalusi style. Others, however, resisted Islamization and migrated northward to the emerging Christian kingdoms in the mountains. Because while Al-Andalus flourished in the south, a resistance was forming in the north. Small Christian groups organized in the most difficult regions to conquer: Asturias, Cantabria, the Pyrenees. There, protected by geography and a faith unwilling to vanish, the first Christian kingdoms began to emerge: Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, Castile. And with them came a movement that would define nearly 8 centuries of history: the Reconquista. The Reconquista wasn't a continuous or centrally planned war. It was a long process, with advances and retreats, alliances and betrayals. But it always had a very clear religious component. It wasn't just a fight for land, it was also a fight for faith. For many Christian kings, reclaiming territory meant restoring the Christian order that, in their view, had been lost with the arrival of Islam. Chronicles spoke of crusades, of holy warriors, of miracles on the battlefield. It was said that St. James, the Apostle, appeared during battles to help the Christians. It's no coincidence that his shrine in Compostela became one of the most important religious centers in all of Europe. For centuries, the peninsula was divided: the south, Muslim; the north, Christian. But that frontier wasn't fixed. It shifted constantly. And in between lived people of all kinds: Christians, Muslims, Jews, sometimes at war, sometimes coexisting. Because yes, there were moments of coexistence. There were cities where 3 languages were spoken, where philosophy was debated, where poetry was shared. But there were also times of persecution, intolerance, and violence. Little by little, the Christian kingdoms gained ground. In 1085, Toledo fell. In 1236, Cordoba. In 1248, Seville. The great cities of the south, once Muslim cultural centers, fell into Christian hands. And with each conquest, churches were built where mosques once stood. Baptism was enforced. Society was reorganized under Christian laws. In the end, only one small Muslim kingdom remained in the south: Granada, a stronghold that held out for almost 2 more centuries, thanks to its diplomacy, wealth, and the internal divisions among the Christian kings themselves. But by then, it was no longer a question of if it would fall, only when. Meanwhile, Christianity took root as the soul of the northern kingdoms. It wasn't just a religion. It was an identity, a cause, a source of pride. Being Christian meant being part of a common project, to recover the land, to restore the faith, to bring back the lost order. And so, over the centuries, Christianity didn't just survive the arrival of Islam. It came out stronger. It became a banner, a justification, a culture, a law. And when, in 1492, the Catholic monarchs entered Granada and brought nearly 8 centuries of Muslim presence in the peninsula to an end, Christianity once again became, more powerfully than ever, the dominant religion throughout Spain. Finally, in 1492, the Catholic monarchs entered Granada. After nearly 8 centuries, the Christian kingdoms had reclaimed the entire Iberian Peninsula. The last Muslim kingdom on Spanish soil had fallen. But the military conquest was only the beginning. What followed was a much deeper process: religious unification. Isabel and Ferdinand didn't just want a politically unified Spain. They wanted a Spain united in faith. For them, Christianity wasn't just a spiritual matter. It was the foundation of order, law, and national identity. One kingdom, one crown, one religion. And anything outside of that had to disappear. That same year, 1492, they issued the Edict of Expulsion against the Jews. Tens of thousands of people had to leave behind their homes, trades, language, and memories. They could only stay if they converted to Christianity. Some converted sincerely. Others did it out of sheer necessity. Thus were born the conversos, new Christians who, for generations, would be watched and distrusted, their faith always in question. Soon after, a similar logic was applied to Muslims. At first, they were allowed to remain under certain conditions. But over time, they too were forced to convert. This gave rise to the Moriscos, Muslims baptized by force, trying to survive between two worlds. To ensure these conversions were genuine, the Catholic monarchs established a powerful and feared institution, the Inquisition. Its mission wasn't to convert non-Christians, but to monitor those who claimed to be Christian, or rather those who said they were. Its purpose was to preserve the purity of the faith, and to do so, it used every means available: interrogations, anonymous denunciations, home searches, torture, and public punishments. The infamous auto da fe were public spectacles where the condemned were paraded, punished, and sometimes executed. The Inquisition became a tool not only of religious control, but of political control as well. It was a way to ensure that everyone in the kingdom thought the same, prayed the same, and lived by the same values. And although today it seems brutal to us, at the time many saw it as a guarantee of order. In this context, Catholicism became the backbone of the country. There was no alternative. All institutions revolved around the church. Children were baptized as soon as they were born. Marriage was a mandatory sacrament. Education was in the hands of clergymen. Laws were inspired by Christian principles. Daily life was shaped by the liturgical calendar: Advent, Lent, Holy Week, Corpus Christi. Religious celebrations were also the people's festivals. And this deeply Catholic Spain was the one that set out to conquer the world. Because right when Granada was taken and the Jews were expelled, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. And with him came not only soldiers and treasure hunters, but also friars, missionaries, and preachers. Evangelizing the New World became a sacred mission. Spain was no longer just a military power. It became the global defender of the Catholic faith. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain stood as the stronghold of the Counter-Reformation, the movement that pushed back against the rise of Protestantism in Europe. While the ideas of Luther and Calvin spread through Germany, Switzerland, and England, they found no foothold in Spain. Protestantism was persecuted from the very beginning. The Inquisition acted harshly, and the country closed itself off to any theological dissent. Religious unity was absolute. The art, literature, music, and architecture of the era reflected this religiosity. You see it in the paintings of El Greco, in the grand Baroque processions, in the monasteries and elaborately decorated churches. Everything breathed devotion, divine glory, fear of hell, and hope for heaven. The average Spaniard lived in a deeply Christian world, fearing sin, trusting in the saints, praying to the Virgin, regularly confessing, and attending Mass every Sunday. Even death was seen as part of the Christian journey. People prayed for the souls in purgatory, ordered masses for the dead, and erected roadside crosses. Religion permeated everything, from cradle to grave. Over these centuries, Spain built itself into a fundamentally Catholic nation, not just because the authorities imposed it, but because the Church was woven into the very fabric of society. Priests were figures of authority. Parishes were the heart of community life. Pilgrimages, processions, and patron saint festivals were, and still are, an essential part of Spain's soul. Being Christian in Spain wasn't a choice. It was the norm, the natural thing, what was expected. What defines someone as a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good Spaniard? And although time changes everything, that legacy is still alive. Starting in the 18th century, the power of the Church in Spain slowly began to weaken. It didn't happen overnight, but the change was already underway. New ideas were arriving from France, from England, from Northern Europe. The Enlightenment brought with it a different way of seeing the world, more rational, more critical, more secular. And although these ideas were slow to take root in Spain, they began to crack the absolute authority that the Catholic religion had held for centuries. The enlightened monarchs of the 18th century, like Charles III, were still Catholic, but they no longer bowed blindly to the Church. They promoted reforms, limited privileges, and even dared to expel the Jesuits. It was the beginning of a tug-of-war between civil and ecclesiastical power that would shape much of Spain's modern history. The 19th century was a whirlwind. Revolutions, wars, coups, republics, restorations, and in the midst of all that, the Church gradually lost ground. Monasteries were shut down, church lands were confiscated, and its income was reduced. Mendizábal's confiscation stripped the Church of many of its properties. In many parts of the country, an anti-clerical sentiment began to spread. A mix of resentment toward the Church's accumulated power and a backlash against centuries of religious imposition. But there was also a strong reaction in the opposite direction, Catholic integralism, which called for a return to a Spain united by faith, with the Church at its center. That gave rise to conflicts like the Carlist Wars, which weren't just dynastic struggles. They were ideological battles between a traditionalist model and a liberal one. For many Spaniards of the time, defending the legitimate throne meant defending the cross. And so, through ups and downs, through liberal governments and conservative restorations, Spain entered the 20th century. A century marked by constant conflict between two visions of the country, one Catholic traditional, and centralist. The other secular, progressive, and pluralistic. The Second Republic tried to completely separate church and state. It removed crucifixes from schools, legalized divorce, and secularized cemeteries. But for many sectors of society, this felt like an attack on the faith. Then came the Civil War. And with it, the confrontation became total. The church aligned itself with the nationalist side, and Franco's victory brought the restoration of Catholicism as the official state religion. During nearly 40 years of dictatorship, the church regained a central role in education, public morality, and politics. Mass was mandatory in many schools, and national Catholicism permeated every aspect of public life. Baptism, church weddings, and communion were unquestioned social norms. Well, the transition brought a radical shift. With the 1978 Constitution, Spain was declared a non-confessional state. Religious freedom, pluralism of beliefs, and the separation of church and state were all recognized. Religion was no longer mandatory in schools. Divorce was legalized. And although the church remained present, it no longer dictated the country's moral compass. Since then, Spain has gone through a deep process of secularization. Fewer and fewer people regularly attend Mass. Many young people no longer get confirmed, marry in the church, or baptize their children. Vocations to the priesthood have plummeted, and yet Christianity is still there. Because even though many Spaniards no longer consider themselves practicing believers, they still celebrate Christmas, Holy Week, and the local patron saint festivals. They still attend pilgrimages, light candles for the Virgin, and baptize their children just in case. Christianity has shifted from being an imposition to being a custom, a tradition, a heritage, in villages, in cities, in daily life. The Christian imprint is still alive, not as an obligation, but as part of the collective soul. It's in the language, the sayings, the given names, the values, the way people understand life and death. Even as more and more Spaniards identify as atheists or agnostics, the vast majority still maintain a cultural relationship with Christianity. In the end, Spain isn't Christian just because the statistics say so. It's Christian because its history has been. Because for 2,000 years, the Christian faith has shaped its landscapes, its laws, its art, its customs, and its holidays. Because it has been persecuted, defended, imposed, celebrated, and debated, but never ignored. And although the future is uncertain and the country may change and beliefs may evolve, one thing is clear. The history of Christianity in Spain is not a footnote. It's an essential part of who we are, of who we were, and for many, of who we still are today.